Next gen single page application compiler written entirely in Common Lisp, Devlog 1. So far I spent about 10 to 15 hours writing it. I'm using HunchInTut as a web server, HunchInSocket, which is a WebSocket module for HunchInTut, and parent script, which translates some of the Common Lisp I write, not all of it. Some of it is generated by using templates / manually written code by me. I wrote some orchestration code in JavaScript by hand, and it's responsible for handling WebSocket connection, evaluating code on the fly, and reloading appropriate components. There are only two functions so far for the developer to use. DevElement, which defines an element that you can use, like div, button, input, field set, whatever. And you cannot use a div, you cannot use an element before you define it. And the second function is devComponent, which basically defines the component. And you will see it in a moment. I already said that. Yeah, so let's define a new, let's maybe start the server first. Okay, so here you can see the generated code. So let's define a div. And nothing happened because it's reloaded in memory on the backend. Here you will see only the components. So nothing happened yet, no div here. And now let's define the component. If the component is called app, it means it's the root component. Otherwise, it's just a child component that is used by other components. And a component, as you will see in a second, is just closure. Yeah, let's compile it. This is what the component looks like. I will talk about the structure later. Now let's add a text content attribute. Here it is. It's a div, text content, hello world. Very easy. Reference, yeah, so let's add a reference. So as you can see, this div has name div underscore 805. So let's call it node instead. Now it's called node. We added some onClick attribute. And now if we click on it, you can see that this, which is the component and the element, is being logged to the console. So I wanted to show that we can bind a local variable of the component to a particular attribute of like text content. And the way it works is you write this lambda, and every time you do setF, local variable, some value or expression, the compiler looks through all these lambdas and replaces the setF text, whatever, with calls to lifecycle, which you will see here in a second. So let's create it. And if it's already created, input button. And button is not necessary here, but I just added it. So now we can see this lifecycle write text, this value. So we created a local variable in the component text with an initial value of initial value. We bound the text content to that variable. We also bound the inputs value to that variable, and we added a non-input event handler that sets the local variable to the input's value. And in the generated code, you see that this setF text, this value, is translated into lifecycle write text, this value. So basically, this lifecycle is the meat and potatoes of every component, and this is where everything happens, the entire lifecycle. The part above it is just a constructor. You can think of it as a constructor. Yeah, so we have this input here. Let's extract it into a child component, and then we will demonstrate how to make the parent component and the child component communicate, so that the parent component can subscribe to the child component's changes to that particular value. We already defined those. Now let's create the child component. Here is the code. And now we replace this input call in the parent component app to child. And since we created this string variable in the child component, we can export it. Exporting means that a parent component can either read that variable's value or even subscribe to it, so it sees every change to that variable. And we set it in the input on input handler. And in the parent you see child, which is basically either a function or a macro, I don't remember. And we can use imports, so you basically import this variable's value. And we pass it a function, so it gets one argument, the string value from the subcomponent, and we set the app's local variable text to that value. So if we reevaluate that, every time we type something, so the input is in the subcomponent, and this div is in the parent component, and this parent component sees the changes to the subcomponent's input value. And that's it. It's very simple. I think that's everything I wanted to show. At the moment the code is kind of ugly. There is some incorrect indentation you can see here. This is because we use parent script. I'm not sure if I can specify the indentation for these expressions, so to fix that I will probably use a custom generated JavaScript translator. And weird naming, so like underscore listener underscore, you know, the naming could be better. Right now a component can only have one root element, like this. In the future it might be something like, where is it? Like this, so another div. Right now this would throw an error, so I might call it something like list, or I don't know, fragment, to group those root elements. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one. And don't forget to leave a comment if you have any questions, or just message me on Twitter or on YouTube. So see ya.